Hey everyone, if we've never met before, my name is Vojchehoske and welcome to the channel where my mission is simple, and that's to enhance the landlord-tenant relationship. So I want to talk about 30-day notices here. Now, under the Nebraska Landlord Tenant Act, the 30-day notice is required, number one, when we're going to raise the rents and we legally can do so. Number two, we need to give a 30-day notice if we're going to change community rules. So for example, maybe you're going to change the hours of the laundry room at your apartment community. We would have to give our residents a 30-day notice of that change. But we also use the 30-day notice in Nebraska to end tenancy. Now, this notice is used by the tenant and the landlord. So if the tenant, if their intention is not to renew the lease with the landlord, they would serve the landlord a proper 30-day notice. If the landlord has no intention of renewing it with the lease with the tenant, then the landlord would serve the tenant that proper 30-day notice. That's the only requirement under the landlord-tenant statute. However, there are other laws we have to comply with, and one of them is the fair housing laws, federal, state, and local. Now, the basic premise, and this is not a fair housing training, but the basic premise of the fair housing laws is we need to treat everybody equally in our processes. Meaning we can't treat people differently in our property management processes. So let me give you an example. We really need to have written policies when it comes to showings, so we don't treat prospective applicants differently. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have, let's say, 4 vacancies in your apartment community, we need to be able to establish in writing which vacant apartment is going to be shown first, second, third, fourth. Have that policy in play. And the reason is we can't treat people differently. So we don't want to take one prospective applicant to apartment 4A and then the next one we take to apartment 4B. So we have our policy in place to protect ourselves from that. Obviously, we typically know that we have to have a tenant selection policy. So when we do get applications, we are going to compare the qualifications of this applicant against our policy. So then we are only selecting those tenants that qualify based on legitimate business reasons, but we're treating every applicant the same. Okay? We have to have the same thing in our maintenance. We really need to have a written policy of what maintenance gets done first. What's the hierarchy of response? And it also applies to lease renewals. Now, this really came to the forefront as a result of COVID. A lot of jurisdictions had moratoriums. Tenant didn't pay their rent, you couldn't evict them. So in a lot of the jurisdictions, the moratoriums didn't really apply to lease renewals. So a lot of landlords say, my tenant isn't paying, they're protected, I can't evict them, but their lease is coming due. So, or they're on a month-to-month lease, so I'm simply going to give them their 30-day notice to not renew their lease. What started happening is a lot of the fair housing investigators and the nonprofits, etc., they started filing complaints against landlords and managers, basically saying that, hey, you discriminated against this tenant because you were treating people differently, meaning you didn't have a standard policy of when a tenant is eligible to renew the lease, or more so when they're not. So you're treating this tenant differently than this tenant. That is a straight up fair housing violation. That is carried over into post-COVID. And so now as a fair housing trainer, I'm really pushing this point. And when I do training on this topic, it is not very popular. And I get a lot of hate mail and pushback on this. And so I'm going to tell you what the standard is and some things you can do to stay in compliance so you're treating tenants the same. We're not treating people differently, which is the right thing to do, but also from a risk management point of view, limit your risk. And that's the whole objective here. In the end, you can do whatever you want. If you feel that having some kind of policy in place that's going to hamper you more, great. It's your business. You can suffer the consequences. I'm only going to provide you things you can do to limit your risk. So the first thing you can do is you should have a written policy on when a tenant is eligible for renewal and when they're not. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I have seen. Most common is, for example, if a tenant has 2 or more 7-day notices to pay or quit, meaning they haven't paid their rent in a 12 or a 24-month period, they are not eligible for renewal. Or if they get 2 or more 14 30-day notice of defaults, they are not eligible for renewal. The other thing you should do is list any or write down any exemptions or exceptions you might have. I'll give you an example of one that I just read in a landlord's policy not too long ago. He had a policy that any tenant that was served 2 or more 7-day notices in a 12-month period was not eligible for renewal unless the lease agreement came due in November, December, and January. Then the tenant was eligible for a 6-month extension. And the reason is we all know that it's difficult sometimes to release a vacant property during November, December, and January. If we can get the tenant to stay till June, July, summertime, then it's a lot easier to re-rent the apartment. So all of this was in writing. And the reason that it's in writing is then it can be applied evenly and consistently to all tenants. So I want to give you a couple of scenarios when we find ourselves in jeopardy. The first one is not having a policy whatsoever. Remember, the fair housing law still requires us to, whether we have a written policy or not, requires us to treat everybody the same. So we have this tenant over here that is a great tenant. They give us, every day they come down and give cookies and donuts, fresh cookies and donuts to our leasing staff. They give our maintenance people candy all the time. They are just awesome, nice, likable people, but they never pay their rent on time. So in the last 12-month period, they've had 6, 7-day notice to pay or quits because they were late on the rent. Over here, we got a tenant that's a real butthole. They challenge you on everything. They send you nasty emails, never threatening, nothing that you could evict on, but they're just nasty people, not nice. They're mean to other residents. You can't wait till their lease comes up so you can say, I'm not going to renew your lease, and they move on. Now remember, you have no policy here. So you renew the lease with the tenant that you like, and you don't renew the lease with the tenant you don't like. You have treated 2 different tenants differently because you did not apply an equal standard. If this tenant over here files a fair housing complaint, the fair housing investigator is going to easily correlate the two. You're going to find yourself in substantial fair housing jeopardy. Now, let's say you have a policy, scenario number 2. You put a written policy into place using the same example here. But your policy says 2 or more 7-day notice to pay or quit, they are not eligible. This person over here that you don't like, they've never had any notice served to them whatsoever. There's been no reason to evict them. You must, because your policy says 2 or more 7-day notices, you must renew their lease. Over here, this person that you like, guess what? They've had 5 or 6 7-day notices over the past 12 months. You're obligated to not renew their lease unless they fall under a written exception because of your policy. So you make a decision. I don't like this tenant. I don't care what my written policy says. They're gone. This tenant over here, I really like. I'm going to renew their lease. This tenant files a fair housing complaint. The investigator is going to easily see that you weren't in compliance with your written policy. See, the point of a policy is to keep you consistent and to be able to defend yourself against a fair housing complaint or a lawsuit, should one be filed, where you can show that you treat everybody the same based on this legal policy. That is what we do in risk management. It's all about risk management, in my opinion. Again, I know some of you aren't going to like this, but I don't know what to tell you. I can only give you the facts. So here's what we need to make sure that we're doing. We need to document everything that our tenant does. Anytime there is any type of notice served to the tenant or served to us, if the tenant serves us a notice, we need to put it in that tenant file. Every communication that we ever have with our tenants, whether it's a maintenance request, whether it is an email, a text message, whether it's a telephone conversation, we need to document the date, the time, and the subject matter and put it in that tenant file. So as that tenant's lease is coming up, we can pull out that tenant file and look at it and determine objectively whether or not they are eligible for renewal. If they are, we offer them a renewal. If we're not, or if they're not, if they violated our standard or whatever, then we can legitimately say they are not eligible for renewal and we can give them the proper 30-day notice either way. Remember, guys, and I know you've heard me say this before, an issue is only an issue when it's an issue, and then when it becomes an issue, you would have wished you would have done X, Y, and Z. And that's the whole purpose. When this will save your bacon. Following these processes will save your bacon when that frying pan gets hot. And that's why we do it. But you have to make the choice on what you want to do. It's your business. I can only tell you from a risk management point of view, best practices, and then it's up to you to decide whether you're going to implement them. If you have any questions about that policy or you need some help, reach out to me. Drop me an email, nebraskalandlord@gmail.com, and I'll help you in any way that I can. If you want to learn more about the 30-day notice and the mechanics, check out this video right here. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next video. Thanks, everybody.